Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for a conversation around human trafficking, shining a light on the issue of human trafficking in Connecticut. My name is Kara During, and I'm the Director of Community Impact here at the Center for Empowerment and Education. And I'm joined by my two colleagues. I'll pass the mic over first to Susan to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Susan Noviello. I am the program coordinator for the Bloom Initiative. We are an organization under the Salvation Army that provides services to survivors of human trafficking. And we are based out of Hartford.
Awesome. Thanks, Susan. And Tamara?
Hi, I'm Tamara Clark, and I am the Director of U.S. Survivor Care at Love 146. Our headquarters is in New Haven, Connecticut.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to have this discussion with you both today. Thanks for joining. And really, to our audience, for those of you watching and listening, the reason we wanted to have this conversation today is because January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And any awareness month is really an opportunity for us to shine a light on issues that are not normally talked about, but that impact a lot of people in our communities. And human trafficking is one of those issues. A lot of people may not realize that it's happening in Connecticut or in the US, but it certainly is, unfortunately, a reality that is impacting a lot of people here in Connecticut all over the state of all different ages, all different backgrounds. So that's what we're here to talk about today. So before we jump into the discussion, we wanted to give kind of an idea of what this is going to look like for us. So we found a survivor story that we're going to be utilizing and sharing clips of to kind of help us moderate this discussion around human trafficking today. So we're going to be using clips from a Texas Pictures documentaries film that's highlighting a survivor's real story about her experience of human trafficking, and her name is Matilda.
I'm just going to share a little bit about Matilda's story. We're going to encourage you to watch the whole clip. It's only about 25 minutes long, but since we're only showing short clips today, we wanted to share that Matilda is a survivor of human trafficking who came out of it. She was raised in a home where she witnessed domestic violence, and then she fell into a domestic violence situation herself. Ended up having 3 children, and she began numbing her pain through recreational drugs. Through her associations of purchasing drugs and using drugs, she pretty much got tricked into trafficking. She was doing some recreational drugs, and the trafficker said, "Now you owe me." And so she went out there, and it ended up being over 10 years that she was being trafficked. And she experienced multiple arrests. She ended up recruiting other girls to be trafficked during this time. And it was upon her 6th arrest that she was offered a program. And she was ready. She was tired. She was willing. She got down on her knees, and hope was there for her. And through that, she ended up going out helping other girls at the places that she was trafficked. So there's a happy ending to this story.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully technology is on our side today, and we'll be able to start with the first clip, and we'll kind of go from there in terms of talking through the different myths and issues around trafficking. So I'm going to make sure we're at the right spot, and just give me a thumbs up, Susan, tomorrow if the sound is working.
If you don't do what I need you to do, we're going to do this to your family, or I got your address, or, they just capture you at your most vulnerable moment. So I don't think that people view it the way it should be viewed. I think that, like I said, they have just the idea in their head, something they've seen on TV or they read in the paper, but there's so much more that's involved. It's so deep, it's so dark, and it can happen to almost anybody. That's why I'm really, really big about advocating that for, and having my story shared.
All right, so that was our first clip there. So we wanted to, as Susan shared with the summary, we wanted to talk about one of the biggest myths around human trafficking is that it always involves kidnapping. If anyone's seen the movie Taken, That's the image that people have in their heads, and that's probably what Matilda's kind of referring to in that clip there of like, we have this image, we have this view on human trafficking, we hear the words human trafficking, and that's kind of what we picture. I think another thing is that a lot of people think of or kind of conflate is trafficking and smuggling, that human trafficking is the same as human smuggling, whereas human trafficking may not always involve that smuggling aspect of kind of pulling people across borders, where it definitely can. A lot of trafficking does happen at the borders or happens when somebody is coming in for asylum seeking and things like that, but it's not always the case. It can happen, anywhere. So I think that's a good place for us to start in terms of what does trafficking really look like? And when does kidnapping play a role versus not? So who wants to start with that one?
You know what? I'll jump in because I think I didn't really kind of explain Love 146. And so the way that we see it at Love 146 is we actually are primarily working with children and youth, right? And so that's really what our services are focused on. And so we may work with youth that are high risk, suspected, or confirmed survivors of trafficking. And so what we see is, children who may be taken from their communities, right? And we have encountered cases of them being locked in rooms, right? Or some forceful kidnapping. But that's not usually the majority of cases, but that doesn't rule it out. But many children are trafficked through empty promises, right? False job offers, right? They're not always physically bound by a trafficker, but they may be scared to seek help. They may be getting threatened. And on a lot of cases, even if they've found a way to leave the situation, or while they're in the situation, they may not know of help or have opportunities to access help. So that's something that we see related to the population we're working with, which is usually children and youth starting around age 13. Susan, I think you all are working with adults primarily.
We're working with adults, and what we're basically seeing is that a lot of our clients are coming in because it's under force, and I mean, not necessarily under force initially, but more of the fraud and the coercion. They're being tricked into believing that this is a boyfriend, or they've already been with a person who they are intimate partners, and they come into a financial instability. And so one partner starts trafficking the other partner. We're seeing a lot of that, of course, and the online, fraud where someone is presenting themselves as someone as a dating interest, and it turns out to be someone who's being trafficked. And there's familial trafficking as well that we're seeing, which is when a family member most often has a drug addiction, and then they begin trafficking another family member for the money to serve their addiction.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think with your summary too of, in Matilda's story, you mentioned her witnessing domestic violence in the home. And so, coming from the perspective of the Center for Empowerment and Education, we primarily focus on domestic and sexual violence in our services that we provide support to victims and survivors. But there's a huge overlap with human trafficking, as you've all mentioned so far in just this short conversation, that a lot of that fraud and coercion is coming from a place of an older partner or an older person posing as a romantic partner to a young person, trying to lure them into a life of glamour or a life away from maybe abuse or trauma that they've experienced in the home. And so they're offering this better life when in reality it is actually an exploitative situation. So that overlap with the domestic violence, and of course there's an overlap with sexual violence, because traffickers may use as a method of force to kind of keep the victim under their thumb and under their control. They may use sexual violence or physical violence or threats of violence to keep them under control. So we see that kind of overlap there too. And I think that leads to another question that we wanted to talk about is like, what are the methods of recruitment? How do traffickers kind of find victims and pull them into this life, or lure them and trick them into this life?
I'll jump in. So I think to Susan's point, a lot of what we've been talking about so far is like relationships, right? Whether that's a friendship, whether that's familial, whether that is a romantic partner, right? Whether that's an authority figure who is the mentor or the leader at the church or the whatever community organization, right? And so it's not usually people's thought of, a long time ago, don't talk to strangers or someone pulling up in a van. That can happen, to your point about the movie Taken, but for the most part, it's relationships. And I think what we see is youth are recruited or brought to this in those relationships, whether it's in person or it can be dating apps. I think we spoke about that a little bit. Social media sites, right? Gaming systems, that's a new way, right? I think there's the virtual world, right? The VR.
Something meta.
And there's younger kids on, like I said, gaming system, connecting with people online, playing games, right? But any way that you can connect with people, traffickers will use that to connect, right? Some sort of way. And so I think if people can just open their mind and understand if there's a way to connect with people outside of your home, that's a way that someone can connect and bring that youth into a situation that's not safe.
Right. It's like wherever kids are, traffickers know.
Wherever
They
people
know that
are.
they're there and they're there too.
Yeah, it could be in person, but a lot, especially after COVID, what we're seeing is all the other methods that are so helpful, we love, right? And so convenient for us. But traffickers are savvy, and so they use that as well and they adjust. Yeah.
I think too, like just taking a step back and giving kind of a broad, very watered down definition of human trafficking, even because we've used these terms a little bit already in our discussion, is this use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of either labor or commercial sex act. And if somebody is under the age of 18, they can't consent to engaging in any of these acts. But oftentimes we do kind of that gets very muddied, and that's part of what we wanted to talk about today as well, in terms of our perception in society around that. But legally speaking, federally speaking, across the United States, anyone under 18 cannot engage in any type of commercial sex act in exchange for something of value. And Connecticut very much follows that, in the law as well. But I think let's talk a little bit more about the social media aspect of it before we move on to the next clip, maybe. Because we talked a little bit about the other myth that we wanted to address in terms of who they're targeting. And we're kind of segue now into how they target those individuals. So, using social media, using online dating apps, this could be either like posing as a younger person, right? Catfishing, making a profile. I went to a training just a few weeks ago, actually, by a former law enforcement officer who was talking about all these emerging technologies in AI where people can go to a website and pretty much find these like pictures of people that they can use to create fake profiles very easily. And you can make as many fake profiles as you want. It's so easy to make them. And they will connect with someone on Instagram, connect with someone on Facebook, connect with someone through the gaming that you were just talking about. And then what? Can we talk about like what does that interaction look like? Like how do they kind of, particularly with kids, it sounds like to start, how do they get them into these situations?
I think particularly with kids, again, it goes back to relationships. It's traffickers are playing like the long game, right? So to your point, they can have as many profiles or whatever. They could be like 10 kids they're working on at the same time. And right, one kid, you're just getting to know them. The other, you've been talking with them for 3 months already, right? They're used to seeing you in their friend group. So you're not a weird person because you're in their friend group and you may be friends with this person they know and this person they know. So it's not weird that 3 months after that, you like a picture or then you eventually start up a conversation, right? And then to start learning more about them, right? And so what traffickers are targeting is vulnerabilities, right? And so the more they learn about whatever that is for the youth, the more they build that relationship of trying to meet some needs, right? Provide whatever that is, whether that's emotional, whether that's monetary, whether that's housing, whether that's food, whatever that is, a need to connect, a need to feel loved, a need to feel like you're smart, whatever that is, they will use those opportunities to connect, to find out what their vulnerabilities are, building that relationship and just taking it a step further and further. That grooming process where they're just little by little getting that youth used to communicating and possibly eventually engaging in something that they may not have done initially.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And Susan, what about with adults? Does it look similar? What are the differences with kind of how they're lured into these situations?
It's very similar in the fact that they're going after vulnerabilities. So often a vulnerability is that an adult may have never belonged, felt like they belonged anywhere, and the trafficker is going to give them that family, or sometimes they'll even say, "Call me daddy." So they call their trafficker daddy because they see they haven't had a daddy. And so traffickers are so skilled in finding that, targeting that vulnerability and feeding into it. And it doesn't take long to be hooked because there's a trauma bond effect that takes place when you are in a very difficult situation and you offer a small act of kindness. A trauma bond can develop. It's called Stockholm syndrome. And then there's that shame factor. You've gotten them in the shame. Now no one else is going to accept me. No one else is going to want me because I've done this. I'm stuck with this person. And all types of lies, I call it the perfect storm, just keep you in this cycle. So it keeps the victim in the cycle. But also noteworthy is this is very addictive for a trafficker, because we've all heard of predators before. It's very addictive. It's very thrilling for the trafficker to be able to hook in a victim. And this can take place within 48 hours. They can be hooked, and the average is 2 weeks. So between 48 hours and 2 weeks, they have this victim out working for them, bringing them money. So they have money involved. They've won power over a girl or whoever it is that they're trafficking. It's the perfect storm for both the trafficker and the trafficking victim.
I actually want to touch on something that you just stated about whoever they're targeting. So I think another myth that, a lot of people hear or believe about trafficking is that it either primarily or only happens to women and girls, but we know that that's not the case, and that particular populations are even more vulnerable to trafficking, and specifically thinking about the LGBTQ plus population. Trans survivors are, very invisible in this kind of discussion around human trafficking. So can we speak to that a little bit too, about like these different populations that are impacted, that, part of why we want to talk about human trafficking is to raise awareness about what it can look like, but who it can happen to, and even speaking to the perpetrators, right? There's that myth that perpetrators are these kind of old school image of like a Halloween costume of a pimp, right? With the gold chain and the gold teeth and the Cadillac and big hat with a feather in it. And that's just not the reality, right, of what traffickers look like today. And if we don't know what they can look like, then it's easier for them to hide in plain sight. So any thoughts on those two things?
Okay. Sorry, can you go back to, because I think we were, what do traffickers look like? But I think we talked, it was a little bit more before then.
Yeah, I was thinking on both ends, right? Like who are the victims? Because a lot of people think they're only women and girls, and who are the traffickers?
Okay. Yeah, it's not just girls, right? Traffickers are about money and profit. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter who that's coming from, right? And so, again, they're looking for vulnerability. So trafficking can happen to anyone, right? Whoever they can connect with and use, whether they are older, younger adult, obviously. And so to your point, we talked about vulnerabilities. So you can think of anyone with those vulnerabilities, like disconnected from family, disconnected from friends in school, right? And they have those vulnerabilities of food insecurity, homelessness, right? Low self-esteem, whatever that is. But to your point about boys, I think, let me see, we definitely see boys in our work. And so I think there's like research that suggests the number of boys affected could be 30 to 50%, probably higher because it's just not reported as much as it should be, right? And so it's not just girls. But also, like I said, anyone can be exploited or trafficked, and they are, but youth of color and LGBTQ plus youth are exploited at higher rates. That is, and it may be connected to those higher vulnerabilities. What community are they coming from, right? And so one of the things, and these are kind of old stats, but it's helpful to know that for the, I think it was 2015 to 2017, children of color accounted for like 43% of the youth population in Connecticut, but they accounted for 64% of the trafficking referrals to DCF during that 3-year time period. That's crazy, right? And so that is, folks need to know, folks in those community need to be aware that this is something that is happening in their community.
Yeah.
And spreading the word about that. And so traffickers, to your point, sorry, I realized that's the next question.
It was a double question. It's okay.
It was a double question. To what we talked about, it could be a family member, it could be a romantic partner. It's now someone may be in that role of a pimp, but they're not dressed like in the movies. It's just a regular person who is that third party who is exploiting them and pimping them in that sort of way. But it's not this caricature that people assume, or this person standing out on the corner, could be, but
Right.
it has evolved into something different.
Yeah. Right. It's not to say it's definitely not that, but yeah, it's the picture is much broader than what we have seen in the media being represented for sure. All right. So I think we can go to our next clip here. So I'm just going to cue it up here. So we're starting, let me look at the time, 10:08. Okay. Oh, and I have an advertisement, of course. So, all right, let me share my screen again. And we're going to show another clip from Matilda's story.
It was just a horrible situation. That's when the tables turned. You need to get up and go get me my money. And I'm like, what money? So you think you've been sitting here smoking drugs and having drugs at your discretion and all that was supposed to be free? And that's when I realized I was in a situation that I wasn't going to be able to get out of. And so with that being said, I was put out in the streets and I was told that I had to start selling my body in order to pay back the debt that I owed. So with that, I started hanging around with the girls that were out there so they could kind of take me up under their wing and show me how this was done. And it just became a vicious cycle before you knew it. I mean, it was just cold and ugly and vicious, and everything that I was doing, I hated myself more and more and more. I was so ashamed. All the days that I cried about not wanting to be in my house, I would give anything to go back, but I just didn't know how. I was so wrapped up in my addiction that I felt like this was going to be it. And this is what I chose. And, full of pride and a huge ego, I was never going to come back to say I was sorry. That just wasn't going to happen because I created this. Just an ongoing cycle of abuse, rape. I was taken in by a gentleman, and I thought that this was going to just be something that was going to, just have a profitable return. And before you knew it, he put a gun to my head and, made me do the things that I didn't never expect that I would have to do forcefully. And so all this, just these ugly demons were attaching themselves, and everywhere I went, it was just becoming colder and darker and deeper and deeper and deeper. I was diving in, and I just didn't even know how to get out anymore. And so I just accepted the fact that that's where I was at and this is what it was going to be. So
Okay. We're going to pause there. So a lot to unpack there. I mean, she talked about her kind of how the traffickers exploited her addiction, which, you know, we research wise and studies, I know there's some statistics out there of anywhere between 70 to 80% of cases involve some kind of drug or substance use, whether it is exploiting someone who already has issues with substances or addiction, or the traffickers are using drugs, they ploy them with drugs to get them addicted and then use that against them and create this debt, right, that they then have to pay off, which is what Matilda was talking about in terms of, you know, they were saying, oh, you thought you got this for free. That's not the case. You owe us. So, I mean, there's a lot there, but anywhere, you know, just kind of that was my reaction to that clip. But anything else that you want, either of you want to start with in terms of your reaction to that clip?
When I work with victims of trafficking, I have found, even though we work for an anti-human trafficking organization, we have victims who come in who are the last to know that they were trafficked.
Yeah.
It's very hard. It's a very hard pill to swallow when you come to the awareness that this was not my boyfriend, that all the lies that he told me were not true. He didn't really care for me. This future he was promising me was just a bunch of empty promises. This is hard for them to digest. And a lot of it, someone like Matilda, if we had a conversation with her, I'm sure she most likely referred to herself as a sex worker. She didn't see herself as a victim. She got herself into it. She was doing drugs. She didn't see that, you know, and this was my choice. Like, I had a choice. He told me I had to go pay off the debt. I just did it. So they take responsibility for this, and then they see themselves as a sex worker. But that is trafficking. There was pressure on her. There was some you know, there was a little bit of coercion there. She thought that it was free. It wasn't. So that's fraudulent. So it's in their minds, it's hard to digest the fact that they're trafficked. And I've had people come up to me and say, I just realized that I was trafficked 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see the same thing, having conversations with youth, and especially if you're thinking about that's probably an authority figure, a person you trusted, an adult. The adults are in your life are supposed to care for you, right? Your parent is supposed to show you love and protection, and this romantic person or the authority person at the community program or wherever that, the church, whatever that is, right? And so learning that that was not right, affects their understanding of, like you said, this is not their fault and that they were a victim, right? And so we do go out and kind of share with youth information, right? To understand what is grooming, what is trafficking, right? And help them to come to that understanding. But you're right, Susan, like people are like, what? That's not what happened to me. That was my boyfriend. And this is just something I needed to do to help us pay the rent. I was just being helpful, right? And not, but I think traffickers, again, purposely do that. This is your fault. This is what you chose. You like this. This is right. That manipulation, that coercion. There's a lot of gaslighting, all of that that goes into the grooming process around this. And I think sex work, to my understanding, is adults who receive money or goods in exchange for consensual sexual services or performances, exotic performances, or to that extent, which I think we talked about this before. Children you're under 18, you can't consent to commercial sex work. And so anytime that's happening with a young person, I think mistakenly, even if it's with law enforcement or media, they'll be identified as a criminal versus a victim sometimes when if law enforcement kind of gets involved, right? Or portrayed as a delinquent or something like that. instead of youth who's being trafficked or exploited. And so the more we get this information and understanding out, we can kind of shift some of that. And sex work, totally fine for adults. That's how you want to make money, and it's consensual. There's OnlyFans, there's, you know, all of that. It's not the same when someone's under 18, they cannot consent to that.
Yeah, I wish I could like bold, italicize, underline what you just said in terms of that, criminalization of victims, because I think a lot of advocates in this field will agree that it's probably one of the biggest barriers to really eliminating and eradicating human trafficking. And that's what traffickers thrive off of, is the fact that victims will be criminalized often before they're ever treated as a victim. And if they are not feeling, I mean, in Matilda's story, she got arrested 6, 7 times. That the amount of kind of the cycle that they're put into the system, and especially as to your point earlier, Tamara, if they are children of color, there's already that pipeline into prison that, they're experiencing due to different systemic racism that they may be experiencing in the school system, in, the workplace, whatever it may be, in their environments. So if they're being thrown in jail and not offered services or support or help, how are they going to identify themselves as a victim, and that they even need that help because they're being treated like a criminal, whether it's children or adults, either or. But yeah, we talked about in kind of preparation for this conversation too, of just, we need to, as a society, eliminate the phrase or term child prostitute. If you see any articles that are like child prostitute arrested or whatever it may be, that doesn't exist, right? Children can't be prostitutes. That's not a thing. But I think that's probably one of the biggest barriers to kind of addressing this issue more seriously in our communities, is people perceive trafficking as, well, they put themselves in that situation, or, well, they can just leave anytime they want. If they're an adult and they're not being held against their will, they're not being held in these cages or whatever that we see in the media, then they can just leave and they can just get out of that situation. But there's so many more layers of that manipulation, threats of violence, control. And if we think about, if these victims are being arrested and then they have a record, they're not going to be able to apply for a credit card or get an apartment, get a credit line, get a house, get a job. So it already stacks the cards way against them, which again, traffickers know. And they're saying, hey, well, I'm still here. I'll take care of you. And this cycle just, continues. So anything else on that?
I think what you're talking about speaks to like the impact. I don't know, were you going to show a video kind of talking about that?
Yeah, I think that's okay. We can segue into that now.
Yeah, just the impact of that, right? There's that now there's trauma, there's shame, right? There's now mental health challenges or addiction, right? Those broken relationships. There may be medical issues now. There's STIs, there's challenges with school or work. There's so many impacts that this can have. And like you said, the traffickers, they're like, yeah, well, you have all of that. You got arrested. You're the one with the charges and everything. And they're just moving on to the next person, because they've got probably a number of people who they are abusing in order to get money. And so there are some long-term and short-term impacts that I think people don't always consider.
Yeah.
Like you could just walk away and everything's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, kind of tying that into our next question was going to be around, what are some of the risk factors that kind of contribute to those vulnerabilities? So I know you spoke about that a little bit earlier, Tamara, too, about, what specific vulnerabilities, but what are other, like, kind of I don't know if we can have a little list of, risk factors that people may have or be experiencing that make them more vulnerable to trafficking. And, we can also kind of differentiate a little bit with youth versus adults and what that looks like, which I know we kind of touched on earlier, but if we want to add anything to that.
I'm curious, Susan, if you would kind of add, or if they're similar, right? They probably are. I think I talked a little bit about like housing insecurity, family rejection, maybe a history of abuse. We talked about domestic violence, especially if they already have a history of sexual abuse, right? That makes it easier for that trafficker because they're used to some of that. Child welfare, juvenile justice involvement, Substance dependence, we've talked about that. Family and friends involved in trafficking.
Yeah.
That's something people may not think about. Undocumented or temporary immigration status. Those are things, again, these are vulnerabilities that someone can exploit. Yeah, Susan, I'm wondering if you can add to some of those, or would you say it's kind of the same regarding
I think
adults?
that I think you really covered the list. I'll just share a story that really speaks into something that happens, as you said, when there's a sexual assault in their history. I would go into the strip clubs and to meet with the girls and talk about awareness and prevention of trafficking and to identify any victims of trafficking there. And I walked outside with the bartender once, and I think she just nailed it. She said, at one time in our lives, someone took control of us. Mm. And now we're here trying and thinking we're taking control of our perpetrator over and over again by living this out. And I thought that she had so much awareness right there that it's almost a trick that their mind plays and how they process their abuse. It's a way to live out their abuse. And it's the abused abuse, right? And so what happens with abuse or traumas that aren't dealt with in a healthy way, it turns into unresolved trauma, turns into mental health issues, and it turns into unhealthy cycles. Mm-hmm. So this is a way that a lot of the victims are living out the unhealthy cycles of their childhood or previous traumas.
Yeah, that's such a good point and such a sad but accurate story to kind of show what it can feel like and look like of this. Ultimately, all of the issues of interpersonal violence are rooted in this power and control over somebody. And so often victims, particularly of human trafficking, are really trying to regain that power in their lives. So that's why, what we were talking about earlier of like, it's not very common that someone will be raising their hand, I'm a victim of human trafficking, right? Or like, I'm a victim of abuse. I remember working with survivors down in Florida, and they very much had the opposite attitude of like, no, I was in control. It was my choice. I knew what I was doing. And it's a defense mechanism because of course they want to believe that they were in control of, what was happening to them, because who wants to feel out of control of their own body and the things happening, that are harmful to them. So they often will have this harder exterior, and also because traffickers really convince them to not trust anybody who's willing to help or, provide support. They can't trust law enforcement, they can't trust advocates, they can't trust attorneys, whoever's coming to provide preventive, awareness, education, etc. Like, that's the whole point of the trafficker. They want to isolate them and cut them off from the people who are trying to help them. So they're going to also kind of manipulate victims into thinking, well, you're in control. This is your choice. Don't listen to those people who are trying to get you out of this situation. They don't understand. They don't know you. They don't care. But I'm here. I care. And that manipulation is really strong. I think the other thing that we talked about a little bit in preparation of this conversation today too is, and we touched on this a little earlier, the pandemic and how that's impacted those vulnerabilities. And tomorrow you talked about like the ways that traffickers show up online. They saw the need. And I don't mean this as a compliment, because I say this all the time of like, traffickers are master manipulators. They're not these, people who are just kind of taking a guess as to where they can find these people or how they can pull them in. They know exactly what to look for and how to exploit it. So when the pandemic hit, there was financial insecurity, there was housing insecurity, like you talked about. More kids were online more than ever before. So, and maybe also experiencing stress and anxiety and fear. And so they knew exactly how to kind of tap into that and connect with kids or connect with adults who were feeling lonely or feeling, scared for their future or lost their job and were financially, vulnerable. So just seeing kind of how the current environment has, impacted victims and those vulnerabilities has been really scary for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tamara, did you want to add something? I saw you were gonna like jump in.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I was gonna jump in there. But I was thinking about that it's interesting that COVID didn't bring this about, right? It was always something that was happening and going on for the longest. But I think to your point, COVID just adjusted we're just online a lot more, right? We're so used to it. Kids are used to being online and it's not, kids have phones the younger they get, right? Like all of that. And so it just was exacerbated. But I think the other thing that we know that there's some protective factors that we can think about, which we've learned also during that time, is like supportive, in regards to youth anyway, supportive adult relationships, right? Because I'm going to go off on tangent here and then go back to the protective factors, but it made me think about when you said like, traffickers will tell folks not to trust service providers or other people that are trying to help them. That is true. But I think to some people's experience in this world, especially maybe it's a kid of color or something, and depending on the community they come from, where some of those people haven't been helpful, right? The trafficker could be a police officer or something, right? It could be people who were well-meaning but failed, or right, didn't protect them. And so I think some of that is both, where we have to be okay and mindful that depending, we have the greatest intention, but we should understand that some kids or youth are coming from an experience where that has been the case. People who are supposed to help them and are coming from organizations did cause more harm or have treated them in a victim, not as a victim, but as a criminal and things like that. So
Right.
sometimes that plays a part. And so supportive adult relationships that they can over time see, this is a trusting person, this person's honest with me, things like that is very helpful protective factor. And so for service providers, we have to understand that and know that, and build that relationship and trust, and not take it personally if people don't automatically think we're the greatest, because some of their experiences are valid and true.
Yeah.
Another thing is like a positive self-image and strong self-esteem. So family and community members helping youth with that and understanding how important it is for them, right? An understanding of healthy relationships. Consent is a new word that everyone's, right? Helping them to understand consent, and refusal skills, right? Perception of legal rights, especially knowledge of online safety. We have to start teaching that younger and younger. Digital privacy settings, awareness of trafficking, right? To your point, Susan, like even there's adults who have no idea. So we have to be talking about this with youth. And then again, those societal things, working on basic needs, right? Community connections, extracurricular activities. Most youth go home and they're on the computer or their phone all day. And so those things are protective factors that we can surround youth with to help offset some of this and their vulnerability to traffickers.
So important. Yeah, we don't want to just talk about what makes people vulnerable. We want to offer that there are ways to prevent this, very much so, and that folks from our agencies are working on that every day. So the next clip, we have 2 more clips. So I'm going to go ahead and queue up the next one. And then this one's a shorter one, and then we'll wrap up with our final.
How do you survive? You start engaging and you start affiliating yourself and you start connecting, like a connection that you can't even describe, a connection with the people. You make them your family. You get so close and bonded with them that they're like almost your everything. And because I had a family and I had kids, I needed to fill that void. And so I created these relationships with these people who were really no good for me. I started beginning to get arrested for prostitution. And I didn't know how to call my family and tell them that, because, of course, I wasn't brought up that way. That's not what I was supposed to be doing. And so
I think that actually ties in what we were just talking about really well. And just this idea too of, you know, particularly when people have this perception in our culture or our communities about it being like, oh, well, they put themselves in that situation or they can just leave at any time. I think with that comes this idea that like they chose this life somehow. And, you know, especially when it comes to kids, it's like we talk about this all the time in our programs of like, there's no child or person. And I think Matilda even says this at some point in the full film. There's no person that wakes up and is like, or as a kid grows up to be, I can't wait to grow up to be a prostitute. Like there's just, that's not a thing that children are, you know, wishing and dreaming about. And adults that find themselves in these situations, oftentimes were even, as we talked about, experiencing abuse early on in their life that led them into this life. So even with Matilda's story of she experienced this abuse or witnessed this violence in her home, she started using substances to cope, and all those things kind of led up to her being then taken advantage of. And it's very hard for someone who is in the middle of it to be able to identify, oh, I'm being exploited and this is, you know, I'm being taken advantage of because of that. So I think that clip did a nice job of kind of tying all of that together. But any other thoughts on that one? And I think any other kind of impacts that we wanted to address here of the trafficking that it can have on someone's self-esteem or image of themselves.
It was hard when I started working with survivors because I wanted a happy ending and I wanted to be able to see a happy ending. And there's so much that sabotage through this process. If you're thinking all the years or all the time spent, there's nothing on their resume. Nothing. Like they come out with, a lot of them have lost school. So they don't have school. They don't have anything to put on their resume. Very hard for them to get bank accounts. That's very challenging. You've got the shame that they walk in and who they are and their identity, and how do you renew that identity within them? And I think that Matilda, one of the reasons that she shines right now is because she did one of the best things she could possibly do, is she went out and helped the people where she was at. And there's something about, I see a lot of acceleration and growth in survivors who do go out and they start giving back to the community or to their population of where they were working. So there is hope when someone can grow to that point where they're actually helping others. There's a lot of healing in the process of when you're helping someone else who is in that situation. But it's hard. It's hard. And we have to tell them this process is hard, but if you work it, it works.
Yeah, thinking about that, one of the things that I think we've done with some of our youth is even to look at their situation and maybe reframe some things, right? One, they're a survivor. Two, wow, you figured out how to do this. You figured out how to build that connection so that you could survive, right? That's amazing. Or
Right.
they figured out how to flip the money, right? That's a skill, right? What are the things that you're not glorifying what happened to them, but to recognize their strengths and what came out of that, right? Maybe this person was a mentor to someone else, right? And they were very encouraging, or whatever that is that came out of that situation, not to minimize it, but to recognize that person and some of the things that they can bring to employment or they can bring to education. While you're really determined and you read a lot of books, you figured out this and you learned this, we can bring that to moving forward in your journey. And so it is challenging, but I think recognizing the strengths of people, no matter their age, is really helpful, again, to kind of just reframe some things if we can.
Yeah. I think the other piece of that is it learning about these barriers to kind of re-entering the world and society, the workplace, school, whatever it may be, because of the trafficking, because of their oftentimes criminal records, that informs the way that we as advocates can advocate for legislation that supports victims and holds buyers and traffickers accountable. So even just looking at the vacatur law that we passed, excuse me, to look at the records and how to vacate their records of any crime that they committed while they were being trafficked. It's so important. These things help to really eliminate those barriers for them to be able to re-enter society.
Absolutely.
All right, so then we have one final clip. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again.
Back to the neighborhoods, and I was doing these little fairs and letting
Uh-oh. Can't hear it.
She's muted.
program. If you
Oops. Sorry, was the sound not working?
You're muted.
everybody else carries the same
That
spirits
better?
around you, so we connected
Okay.
well. So I started going back to the neighborhoods, and I was doing these little fairs and letting them know about the transitional living facility that I found out about and how recovery is possible. And Miss Kathy Griffin, you know, she's got a reentry program. If you don't get to know her now, you're going to get arrested, and you're probably going to get to know her later. So I'm trying to get you to know her now. So I would take hygienes, hot dogs, and you know, I started doing it on the days that were very lonely for me, Mother's Day and Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day, just kind of send a message of love. I did it so much that I was recognized on Fox 26. So it became that I was this person and I was doing these things and I was impacting the community, and some of the people that I was involved in while I was doing my prostitution and my addiction, they were coming to group. And so I was starting this little thing and I was loving it. And I wanted to
Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so just hearing from Matilda herself about how she was able to turn her experience into a way to help others is really inspiring, and a message that we wanted to kind of end on for this discussion here today, that this is a very dark and gloomy topic. It's very difficult to talk about, to hear about, to acknowledge and understand. So hearing from survivors themselves is a really important place to kind of start as well. Listening to survivors, uplifting their stories, listening to real experiences, and just helping again to shine a light, you know, not bringing it back to our title of our discussion today, but to help shine a light on this issue. So any final thoughts, comments before we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to say that these people who get involved in trafficking and become victims of trafficking, if they had a supportive, strong community, it most likely wouldn't have happened. They had a strong family, and if they were able to function through their education and be supported through that, if they were able to make a living. So often a trauma has come in of some type of abuse, and it took a lack of a community for them to get involved. It's going to take a community to assist them in coming out. And one of the things that I love about collaborating with Kara and Tamara today is that, you know, working and joining forces together and creating that community for these victims. We can't do it alone, even though we are a sex or a human trafficking agency. We have to rely on all the other community resources out there, community service providers. And so it takes that full community to wrap around these survivors. And I've seen it over and over again, and it is beautiful, and it works.
I love that.
Absolutely. And we love to hear the stories. We get youth who call us back and say, I graduated, or I'm starting a family, or, you know, can you come to my graduation, right? Building those trusting relationships and being a part of their healing journey. To your point, Susan, it may not always work out right away, but we can be impactful to someone's journey, and not just us as service providers and nonprofits or whatever, but folks in the community learning and understanding what this is and being supportive and offering support and empathy and understanding is so important. Yeah, it's great to hear and to end on the hope. There's always hope. There's always hope for things to change and for people's, this doesn't define someone's life. They can always go on and do more and help others.
I love that. Oh, amazing. Yeah, my final kind of comment is really to you all watching this or listening to this, that you, just by participating in this conversation today, listening to how we talked about these issues, educating yourself on human trafficking, you're already a part of the solution and helping us to end this issue. So many people want to shy away from it or are too afraid to kind of dive into this topic because it is heavy, it is dark, it is scary, and it is vulnerable to kind of allow yourself to educate yourself on this issue that is impacting people in our communities all throughout Connecticut, all throughout the United States. So just by participating in this and listening is, helping this issue. So share this video with your friends, with your coworkers, other people in your life to help spread the word. Just because January is ending does not mean that human trafficking awareness should end. So, continue that education. And with that, we kind of wanted to close out with a quick plug of our services, just how to kind of find out more information about us. So, Susan, if you want to start, and then Tamara, you can share your websites or information on how people can access support.
Absolutely. So you can find us. We are the Bloom Initiative. You can, we're under the Salvation Army, Greater Hartford Area Services. And we offer comprehensive case management services. We do provide prevention education training. We also have a street outreach where we hit the streets of Hartford and we seek to reach victims of human trafficking actively on the streets. So those are the services that we provide. So we're always looking for volunteers for that street outreach as well, if anybody else wants to give back.
Awesome. Any website or hotline phone number you want to give?
Yeah, so it's 860-543-8413 is our phone number. And you can reach us at Salvation Army Greater Hartford Area Services.org.
Awesome. Thanks. Tamara, how about you?
Okay, so you can find out more about Love 146 at LOVE146.org. Our website is amazing. You can find out about our services. We primarily are working with folks around mobilization, getting the word out, volunteers, spreading the word about trafficking, also prevention work and survivor care work. And so if you log on to our website, you can find out all about which one of those fits you best. And there's also just a lot of information around myths, stories. We have some web series, a lot of information for folks to educate themselves as well. So check out our website, love146.org.
Yeah, your videos are amazing too. The educational videos are fantastic. So definitely check both of those out. And for the Center for Empowerment and Education, we are located in Danbury and we serve 11 towns in our catchment area as south as Reading, Ridgefield, and up to Sherman and New Milford area. And so we primarily serve victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And it's of any age. We're confidential, no cost. And for people of all identities, we have multilingual advocates. So you can reach either of our two 24/7 hotlines. Our domestic violence hotline is 203-731-520. Sorry. now my brain is is malfunctioning. I'm going to pull it up so I make sure I don't say it incorrectly. 5206. So set 203-731-5206 is our domestic violence hotline. And then our sexual assault hotline is 203-731-5204. And you can also learn more about our services at our website, which is thecenterct.org. So I just want to thank you both again for having this conversation today. Thank you for talking about human trafficking for a whole hour and change. This was a wonderful conversation and hopefully it helps to educate our community more about this really important issue. And thank you for everybody who is watching, and help us spread the word, and have a wonderful rest of your winter.
Thank you.